To this point in time in Phase 4 of the MCU, they've added 4 new storytellers to their director team. So today we're going to stop and rank all 19 MCU directors tier ranking style. As we go into this, I'm ranking these directors based off 3 criteria. First off, do their MCU films have a unique directorial style, or do they feel like they were directed by an MCU committee? Second, how much have their films affected and influenced and made an impact on the MCU as a whole? Not on a story level so much, but in influencing the way MCU films are made. And the third one on here, were they able to tell a compelling, coherent story inside of the MCU? One final thing before we get started, if you want to make a tier ranking of your own, I've got a link down below of my tier ranking template so you can make your own MCU director tier ranking. And let's get started. And we're going to kick things off at the beginning with Jon Favreau, the director of Iron Man 1 and 2. And let's just get straight to it. I think he's a top tier MCU director. He was the person that cracked the code, that set the template, that set the tone for everything that came afterwards. There's a very specific vibe that MCU films give off. There's specific elements that are incorporated in each of their films, and all of it goes back to what Jon Favreau did with the original Iron Man. Beyond that, he's the person that gave us Tony Stark, that was the anchor for the first 3 phases of the MCU. Just those movies, this universe works so much because he was so good in that original film and continued to be so good in all the films that proceeded afterwards. And then maybe most importantly, he was able to tell a great standalone story that also you could build a universe off of. And when you put that all together, it's distinctly Jon Favreau, and it laid the foundation for everything that came afterwards. And I don't really hold Iron Man 2 against him. There's a bunch of great things in that film. The script is kind of a mess, and he openly stated when they announced a 2-year turnaround that they needed more time. So I blame that one on Kevin Feige. I think Favreau is top tier. Next up is Louis Leterrier for The Incredible Hulk, and I enjoyed this film. I'm a defender of this film. I think the action is handled well. It tells a different type of MCU story. But at the end of the day, I gotta say, I'm gonna put him in the misfire category, that bottom tier. This isn't because he did a terrible job with the film, but simply put, as an MCU director, this movie is widely regarded as the black sheep of the MCU. Tonally, it doesn't fit with the other films. They didn't continue his style, they continued Jon Favreau's style. Likewise, in the storytelling, there was a lot of stuff behind the scenes where they reworked the movie, they cut 40 minutes out. Edward Norton was very heavy-handed in the process, in which case Louis was kind of shackled a little bit in what he could do with the project. And so while I think the action was handled really nicely, I like that it was influenced heavily by the old 1970s TV show. As for his influence on the MCU, as for the actual storytelling that kind of takes place here, it's not the best. Moving right along, we have Kenneth Branagh for Thor, and this is a director who has a very long career, making many different prestige films and some big gigantic misfires, and I would say this one's kind of right there in the middle. And so even as an MCU film, I'll put it in the decent category. Now, Kenneth Branagh became famous as a storyteller, filmmaker, for his adaptations of the works of Shakespeare, and you absolutely feel that in the Asgardian segments of this film, where he just brings that sense of grandeur to everything that he does there, and the scope, size, casting Anthony Hopkins. You just, even the themes in it about fathers and sons and their egos and working through and acting decently. But I think it's a movie that's tone is kind of all over the place. It's not in control of the tone, and the story itself doesn't properly build momentum as well as I think that it should. So all that grandeur is lost when you get to Earth, and that's kind of intentional, but I just don't think it never really works fully for me. And this feels like them figuring out how to do the MCU right, figuring out the tone, the vibe, and how to do what they did with Iron Man, but on a cosmic level with the different types of characters, and they hadn't quite gotten it right yet. So I don't think Kenneth Branagh was a total misfire, but there's some kinks here. Moving right along, we have Johnston for Captain America, the First Avenger. And this one's a tricky one for me because I think he brought a very distinct style to the way this movie was directed, the way he took the production design, the way that he worked with the composer. There's so many great elements that take us back in time into this MCU-ified version of World War II. And in the behind-the-scenes features, he talks about specifically trying to use the types of lenses that were used in older types of films. So it just kind of gives it this old feel while obviously being state-of-the-art 21st century blockbuster at the exact same time. And all of those were choices by the director to try and give the movie a specific feel and vibe to it. And all of those elements, I think, absolutely work. But I've never been crazy about the way the main plot of this movie works, at least the villain plot. I love the origin stuff with Steve, but as soon as the actual Red Skull plotline kicks in, especially when we're montaging through World War II, it just doesn't fully work for me. And so the aesthetics here, the look, the score, production, all these elements that the director pulled together, awesome. Story and storytelling, not quite top notch. So for me, I'm going to put him in that middle section. He is in the good tier. Moving right along, we have Joss Whedon for the Avengers and Avengers Age of Ultron. And despite apparently the guy being a total jerk, and as much as I hate everything that he did to Zack Snyder's Justice League, when it comes to the MCU, I gotta go top tier, and I think he's even more influential than Jon Favreau. Now, you have to keep in mind, prior to the Avengers 2012, we had never gotten a team-up movie like this before, where someone had taken all these different franchises, mashed them together, and found a way to get the tones to jive from multiple different franchises. And he pulled that off. And that's what has defined the MCU ever since. These crossovers where you manage to take two characters that don't belong in the same movie, put them together, and get the tone right. Beyond that, you've always had humor in MCU films, but Joss Whedon took the quippiness, the one-liners, to this whole other level that has remained true to this point in time. Whether you think that was a good thing or a bad thing, Joss Whedon is the person that really created the non-stop joke per minute pacing of humor in MCU films. This guy was incredibly important to the MCU and delivered one of the best theater experiences I've ever had with the original Avengers. That'll bring us to Phase 2 and Shane Black for Iron Man 3. Now, this is a weird one because I think Shane Black delivered a solid Shane Black comic book movie. I'm not sure that he delivered a particularly good MCU film. I think the story's coherent. I think the humor works. He handles the action, and it definitely has his distinct flair to it. But I'm not sure that he was the best fit for the MCU, so that kind of creates a bit of a sticky situation, but I'm going to put him in that next to bottom category. I think he delivered a good movie, a movie that I enjoyed. I think a movie that is way underappreciated, but inside of the MCU, the plot points didn't continue on. It seemed like he was trying to add subversive elements in there just because he likes to be subversive, not because it served the MCU as a whole. And so a movie that didn't really influence much in the future of the MCU, but definitely has his distinct style. So that's well played. That'll bring us to Alan Taylor for Thor: The Dark World. And I'll just go ahead and get right to it. He's in the bottom tier misfire. This guy right here is a legend when it comes to directing television. He directed a bunch of Game of Thrones, in particular, a bunch of very popular episodes. And because of that, he got offered some directing gigs for films, and originally Patty Jenkins was going to direct Thor: The Dark World, and her and Feige, I guess, couldn't see eye to eye, and eventually she had this whole kind of Shakespearean love story she wanted to do, and they wanted to go in this other direction, so they bring in Game of Thrones guy, and the end result is this very mediocre film that can't decide if it wants to be Lord of the Rings in space, buddy comedy, rom-com, weird fantasy. The storytelling, while the story itself isn't that complex, it's kind of confusing because it doesn't do a great job of communicating the information you do need to know and knowing what's important and telling you things at the right points in time. And so while when it comes to television, he's a legend as a director, but when it comes to directing movies, and in particular the MCU in this conversation, big, gigantic misfire. Next up, the Russo Brothers. Once again, we'll just cut straight to the chase here, and they are top tier, and I would say they are the top MCU directors. Simply put, they've got 4 movies in the MCU. All 4, I would say, are easily top 10 MCU films, and depending on what you like in your MCU movies, a lot of people think Winter Soldier's the best MCU film. Obviously, a ton of people have Endgame on top. I've got Infinity War on top. But it's a big debate over which one of their movies is the best MCU film, not do they have a great one. Because everybody knows they consistently delivered top-tier MCU films. And they were able to still have humor and levity in their films, but I felt like they had a little bit of a more serious tone to them. There is a specific vibe. It's not as flashy as like a Taika Waititi or Sam Raimi, but they have a specific way that they do set the tone for their sequences, the way they shoot their action, and of course, given the movies that they directed were just pivotal in shaping phases 2 and 3. Obviously, Kevin Feige thought they were doing such a great job at what they were doing that they were the ones that were given Infinity War and Endgame, and they knocked them out of the park. And if you're able to be the person that does that actually pulls off Infinity War and Endgame, you are the person that gets this franchise. You're the ones that are just able to pull it together. They're the top directors. Moving right along, we have James Gunn for Guardians of the Galaxy 1 and 2, as well as having a pretty big influence on certain sequences within Infinity War. And this is one of the MCU directors that I think has best actually made a James Gunn movie in the MCU. Not just made a good movie in the MCU, but one that feels like his distinct project. From his use of music, to the way that he shapes his characters and works with group dynamics. Even as much as I have issues with Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, it's such a distinct James Gunn film. Even with his worldview and a number of other things like that, that he brings something unique. And so I think very easily he's in that very good category. I was even tempted to put him in the top tier, but obviously I do have my issues with Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, and I don't think he fully pulled off the story with that one. But also, he has a tremendous influence on certain characters. It's limited to the specific characters, where everyone else in that top tier, I think, shaped the MCU as a whole, and James Gunn kind of shaped the cosmic space adventurers of the MCU. Closing out Phase 2, we have Peyton Reed for Ant-Man, and I'm going to put him in the good category. Now, I know a lot of people aren't crazy about the Ant-Man films. I think he was able to deliver solid, good, lighthearted entertainment. And sometimes that's good enough to make movies that just are fun to watch, that don't demand much from you. They're very unassuming. That's what Peyton Reed was able to do with these films. At the same time, I think in that middle category, I think he's the weakest in the tier because he doesn't have a distinct style. If you ask me kind of what does Peyton Reed specifically do with his films, I don't know what I would tell you. I don't know what that is that he adds to it. He delivers solid films. They're not swinging for the fences. They don't knock it out of the park. Solid films, but they do just kind of fall in line with the MCU vibe. A little bit more lighthearted than most, in which case he gets the job done, but he's not going to that next level or doing anything just unique or distinct. Moving right along, we have Scott Derrickson for Doctor Strange. And this is a tricky and a frustrating one for me, and I'm a little bit disappointed that we didn't get a second film from him that might have dramatically changed my placement for him. Based off us just having the one film, gonna put him in the good category, ahead of Peyton Reed. And this movie, I would say, has the best visuals in the entire MCU. Just the stuff that he came up with of how to visualize all the magic, the sorcery, these other realms, kaleidoscope reality, Escher drawings brought to life, bending reality like Inception and Dark City, except taken to this crazy other level while delivering action sequences. And even when they're doing more direct, just wizard stuff, it's more exciting than any wizard stuff in the Harry Potter films. And I think that's amazing. But with the one movie we got, it also feels like he was able to do his crazy stuff with the visuals, but on a story level, they just mashed it into the MCU template. Like, he had to stick to the formula, have crazy visuals, and he did that, but he had to stick to the formula, in which case, on a story level, I don't think it's great. So I don't know what he could do if he was able to really concoct his own story and have fun with the storytelling, but on a visual level, absolutely did something very cool, very distinct with his film. That'll bring us to Jon Watts, and I'll put him in the middle category. Jon Watts is a tricky one for me because obviously I'm a big, gigantic fan of Spider-Man Homecoming. Spider-Man No Way Home was something special. I have my issues with Far From Home, but he delivered a solid trilogy of MCU Spider-Man films, and a couple of them I think are top tier, and one of them I think did some really cool special things. My problem with Jon Watts is that I don't feel like he has a distinct style. I don't know, if you ask me to describe what's a Jon Watts movie, what's that like? I might reference The Breakfast Club, but that's to say that he tried to make his movies like something else. It's not to say what his movies are really like and talk about specifics of his ability to do things. And so he's like a guy that he gets the job done. He delivers a film, but I don't know what his style is. Likewise, I feel like he cheats the story for the sake of entertainment. My big problem with Spider-Man Far From Home is that I don't think the plot makes any sense about Tony Stark leaving a pair of glasses to a high schooler that's been dead for 5 years that's a deadly weapon that has no instructions. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. It sets up the movie. It's convenient to give us a plot, but it doesn't make any sense. And then likewise, I have issues with the setup for Spider-Man No Way Home, in which case Jon Watts can deliver fun entertainment, but lacks kind of that distinct style. And I think he cuts some corners to deliver the entertainment, and he's not as worried as having a coherent story that actually holds up. Moving right along, we have Taika Waititi. Now, this is a director with a distinct style, from the bright colors that he brought to everything, to his sense of humor, the way that his characters interact, the types of characters that he adds into movies. Much like James Gunn, immediately you know you're watching a Taika Waititi movie as soon as things get started. And you could just, like, we just got our first trailer for Thor Love and Thunder. And once again, bright colors, his sense of humor, his character dynamics and interactions all over that film. In which case, when it comes to, does he have a style? Absolutely, he does. I would argue he might have delivered the funniest film in the entire MCU. And he was the person that kind of course corrected the Thor franchise and got it back on track. So for me, easily gonna throw him up in the very good category, much also like James Gunn. His movies have a distinct style, but it's not like he swayed the whole MCU in a different direction, influenced the entire thing. His movies just have that distinct style to them, and so absolutely top tier, delivered solid film, but in the terms of actually influencing the MCU, not into that top category. Then we have Ryan Coogler, and I'll put him right next to Taika Waititi. I think that he delivered a film that has all the spectacle that you're supposed to have in an MCU film. It still has the humor, but he delivered something that was important to him and it's a very thematically rich film that manages to do that within the confines of an MCU film, where it tackles ideas, it has things it's exploring, but it doesn't do that by having characters preach at the audience. It does it by telling a compelling story. Along the way, he tells this rich story about a kingdom and the passing of the torch and how should it influence the rest of the world. It has all the stuff you're supposed to have in an MCU film, but Ryan Coogler added all this extra stuff in, kind of did something special inside the MCU in that regard. And that will bring us to the last of the new directors from Phase 3 with Anna Boden and Ryan Fleck for Captain Marvel. And while I don't think that this movie is a total train wreck, I have some fun with it. I do think it has some merit. I'm going to put them absolutely in the misfire category, and I'm going to say they are the worst directors in the MCU. At least what they were able to do with an MCU film. Even below Alan Taylor, who I felt made a very mediocre film, Captain Marvel is kind of a bizarre film. The tone is out of control. There's all sorts of holes in the story. There's some performances that I don't know what they had Annette Bening doing in certain sequences. The way they decided to visualize things, I absolutely do not understand what they were thinking in some of these moments. In which case, it's a movie that absolutely feels like it was directed by an MCU committee, and whoever was behind the wheel didn't fully have control of things. You stop and think about it. This movie made $1 billion, and nobody knows who they are. That's weird. Like, directors that direct a movie that make $1 billion, you get like all sorts of job offers, and they're not returning to direct the next one. Like, whether they didn't want to, the experience was so bad, or Kevin Feige was like, that didn't work. As for their contributions to the MCU, weird and definitely not the best. And that will bring us to our Phase 4 directors. First up is Kate Shortland for Black Widow, and I will put her in the decent category. Now, I enjoyed this film, but I think it's a bit of a thankless job because it was the MCU film that just inherently was always going to feel 5 years too late, inconsequential, and that's kind of what it was. And I enjoyed a lot of things that she did with the film, of kind of having one that felt a little bit more personal about a family. There's sequences that kind of gave it a bit more of an edge, and because it was kind of had this edge about the mistreatment of these girls that are being controlled, it made the stakes more personal than epic. I dug all of that. And then there's all the ways in which you could feel the MCU committee coming in and being like, all right, and now it has to be a flying space station, and the third act involves people like skydiving while sword fighting through debris, just like a video game. And so I think it just kind of one of those movies where it doesn't feel like it has that distinctive a style. A little bit of an edge, it does, but very indistinct style. A lot of just kind of the generic MCU spectacle kind of thrown into there. Not a total misfire, but I would say the lowest of even the decent categories. Moving right along, we have Destin Daniel Cretin. Now, when they announced him as directing Shang-Chi, I was actually really excited about that because I've been a big fan of some of his previous films that I just feel like he tells smaller stories that just kind of, they resonate on my wavelength. But I don't think that necessarily fully translated to the MCU. And I dug Shang-Chi. I gave it a positive review and I still stand by that. But on a directorial level, do I feel like you really got a lot of him in there? I'm not sure that I felt that. As someone that was a big fan of a couple of his films prior to this, I don't feel like we got enough of that in the film. And then I felt like we got a lot of, well, it's an MCU film, so you gotta crank it up to 11 with the spectacle. You gotta throw stupid jokes in there, and we gotta throw this other cameos and stuff in there. In which case, it felt a little bit like committee directed to me. And one of the things I loved about the movie is that it showcased a bunch of Hong Kong martial arts styles, but even in that, they didn't trust that. They had to do all this stuff where people are swinging from the outside of buses with CGI instead of trusting the Hong Kong style influenced choreography. And so I think the movie itself is good, but I don't feel his stamp on it as much. Our next to last director to discuss will be Chloe Zhao, and this is almost certain to be the most polarizing placement on the tier list and all of your lists as well, because Eternals is one of those movies that just split audiences, and if you dug it, this is one of the best directed films in the entire MCU, and thus she's one of the best directors in the entire MCU. But for a lot of people, including this guy, we didn't think that Eternals worked. And her bag of tricks didn't fully translate to what the MCU is, and so the merger fell flat. So for me, I've got her in the bottom tier. I've got her as the top of the misfires, but I have her in that misfires category. Just, I don't think she was a good fit for the MCU. Now, credit where credit is due. It is a gorgeous film. It's maybe the best shot film in the MCU. It tries to do a bunch of things, but I also don't think it succeeds at them. I thought it had too many characters, too much exposition, too much backstory, and the way in which the story was told, the order in which it was told, was bizarre, and it was intertwining so many ideas and themes about moral dilemmas, about what they should and shouldn't do and why, that it just imploded under its own ambitions. It just did not come together and work for me. And one of the ultimate jobs of a director is to be able to pull it all together and tell a compelling story that intertwines all of its themes and ideas and everything. Her skill as a storyteller, I don't think translated to the demands of a MCU blockbuster with a gigantic cast. And our final director, Sam Raimi. And this is a little bit of a tricky one for me because, without question, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness is distinctly a Sam Raimi film. His unique style is overtly on display. And what I loved about it is that it wasn't Spider-Man Sam Raimi. It was Evil Dead 2 Sam Raimi. It was creepy, weird, campy, goofy, horrific, all mashed together. And so absolutely, you have a director with a distinct style. At the same time, the first 40 minutes of the movie felt like generic MCU. So it's a little bit tricky when you have a movie that kind of has some of that, yeah, this feels like another MCU film. Why? I thought Sam Raimi directed this. Then at a certain point in time, it kicks in. It's like, this is Sam Raimi right here. So for me, I absolutely think I have to put him in the middle category. I'm going to put him on the higher end of the good category, though, because it was so distinctly Sam Raimi. Of his visuals, his sense of humor, his weird. This movie had a little bit of that factory MCU stuff going on with it. and a ton of Raimi, so he's distinctly in the middle category. So there you have it. That is my tier ranking of them. Be sure to share your thoughts down below, or if you want to use my tier ranking to make your own tier rankings, the link is down below in the description. Also, I got a ton of MCU content going on right now. You can check out my MCU versus DCU ranking right there, as well as my deep thoughts on all 5 Doctor Strange movies right there. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies too much.